You've written an entire book about Blaise Pascal.
Mm-hmm.
What was the biggest impact he's had on the world?
Well, I guess it would depend on who you ask. If you ask a physicist, they would probably tell you he proved the existence of a vacuum, because people didn't tend to believe they existed before. If you asked an urban planner, he would say he invented buses. We can tell that story later on if you like. If you asked a mathematician, they would say he invented or helped to invent probability theory, which lies behind all the science of insurance and pretty well everything we do these days. But I think for me, I would say the biggest impact he had on history is through one particular book that is the one thing that he wrote, which is still read today, which is his Pensées, which is this remarkable book of reflections on human life, God, our place in the world. And people still read it today, 400 years after he was born and after he lived. And so that is a set of reflections that makes people think still, deep thoughts about the nature of human life and what it is and what we're doing here on this earth. That, I think, is his biggest legacy.
This is an incredible man, and I've really enjoyed reading your book, learning all about him. He's someone that essentially did the first scientific experiment properly, and his legacy is incredible. So let's delve into this. I want us to set the scene here. He's born in 1623. What's going on here? This is somewhere between the Battle of Hastings and the invention of the iPhone.
Yeah.
Let's go from there.
Exactly. Well, 1623, he was born in a place called Clermont in the Auvergne, which is kind of in the middle of the south of France, in a kind of mountainous area or hilly area around there. And what's going on at the time? Well, you've got a 30 Years' War, which is a kind of a war that happened over 30 years, strangely enough, in the title, from 1618 to 1648, which is a huge war that consumed most of Europe and was a kind of big background to France, the life in France at the time. It was a time when the king was Louis XIII. During his lifetime, Pascal's lifetime, became Louis XIV. And at that time, also, the time of Pascal's lifetime, we had the Civil War here in England, which is, again, a time of real convulsion. So there's a lot of social change going on. So the backdrop to Pascal's life is a lot of warfare, a lot of dispute, a lot of controversy. You've got the aftermath of the Reformation, struggles between Protestants and Catholics in Europe. What is Europe going to become? Is it going to become Protestant? Is it going to become Catholic? You've got the rise of science, this sort of scientific endeavor. They get experimental method. You've got a lot of things going on in philosophy, René Descartes and people like that. So you've got a lot going on in the background. So he lives at a really sort of a time of real turmoil in European life, and that's kind of where he is. So he's not quite at the iPhone, although he did have a little part to play in that. We can talk about that in a moment. It's not quite the Battle of Hastings, not as much to do with that either. He never visited England, so he never came here, but he lived in his entire life in France. But that's something about the background to his life and times.
It's such an exciting time period, and I've never paid it any attention at all growing up. Partly because I've never been taught it in school, and partly because the quantifiable nature of this period is less impressive than something like the advent of the internet, right? Or the Industrial Revolution. I mean, this is an era of ideas and experimentation. And that's what I love so much, but what also perhaps makes it slightly inaccessible to people on the surface level until they scratch a bit deeper and find all of these amazing stories. So let's go back to Pascal in his early years. You often hear him being described as this precocious talent. And you've got this, I don't know what the word would be for precociality or something similar. Precociousness, But you've got this precociousness paired with these physical ailments and struggles that he's having, which I think goes on to form his thinking quite fundamentally. So speak to me about Pascal and his early years.
Well, I say he was born 1623. His mother died when he was about 3 years old. That's quite a significant thing because it meant that he never really remembers his mother. His father was a really significant figure for him. His father was a kind of intellectual, like to think of himself as an intellectual, like to kind of gather with all the kind of clever people in Clermont where he lived. In fact, actually, when Pascal's 9 years old, his father thinks, well, Clermont's a bit of a backwater, not many bright people around here. I'm going to move the family to Paris, which is what he does. And that was a kind of big move for the family and big move for Pascal himself. He had two sisters, an older sister, Gilberte, who was a kind of slightly bossy older sister who kind of organised the family and told everybody what to do, and a younger sister, Jacqueline, who was in her own right, was quite a significant figure. She was a very artistic, quite poetic person, wrote poetry in her early years, but a very religious person. She became she joined a kind of convent, which is part of a movement called Jansenism, which Pascal was drawn to. So that's his kind of family background. And in his early years, he was recognized as being someone extraordinarily bright. There's a story that's told of him when he's really quite young. I think he's about 8 years old at the time, when his father, he was homeschooled. So he never went to school, never went to university in his entire life. His father homeschooled him. And there was a story about how his father thought that you should begin by teaching someone Latin. So he taught him how to speak Latin and how to read Latin, taught him some basics of sort of language and all that kind of thing. But he thought mathematics, we'll leave that till later on, because that's a kind of advanced science. And we'll get onto that when he's a teenager. But Pascal, one day, his father comes into a room where Pascal is sort of drawing on the floor with the chalk. And he looks and he thinks, that's a bit weird. What's he drawing there? And he realized that he's basically drawing out Euclidean geometry. In other words, Pascal had kind of discovered the basic principles of one of the key theorems of Euclidean geometry at the age of 8. Now, did he read it in a book when his dad wasn't looking, or had he worked this out himself? Probably he had worked it out himself. But one of those stories that is told about him that gives you the impression here is a bit of a child genius. Here is someone who, right from the early days, people realized had a more than average intelligence, ability to think new thoughts, a kind of boldness in his thinking. He wasn't necessarily going to toe the line. He was going to, take the risk of incurring his father's wrath by getting into maths too early. So it tells you a little bit about Pascal, and it's one of those stories.
Am I right in thinking he's kept homeschooled because of his precociousness, because of how intelligent he appears to be?
Yeah, there's a certain element of that. His father kind of recognizes, I've got a bit of a genius on my hands here. I think his father probably didn't trust the kind of public education system. And so he kept all 3 children home, especially Blaise, to homeschool them. So exactly right. Yeah, I think it was because his father thought, this child needs special treatment.
His older sister gets into the field of Jansenism, and we can get onto that a bit later.
Yeah.
But before that, it would be interesting to hear about his father, Etienne, and his religious background, raising Pascal as a kid.
Yeah. Well, Etienne is a fairly conventional Catholic. It seems that Pascal's mother was quite a devout Christian. All the stories that are told of her is that she was a very sort of devoted to the poor of the parish. She was very generous in giving and taking people into the home and so on. Pascal's father, they didn't speak much about his religious devotion. He was a kind of conventional Catholic, went to mass, did the kind of religious stuff, but it wasn't a massive, important part of his life. He was more interested in these philosophical and mathematical and philosophical questions that were debated in the sort of intellectual circles of Clermont at the time.
How casual is his approach to Christianity and Catholicism for someone living in France in that period?
Yeah, it's pretty typical. I guess today you might think, the typical person in Britain isn't that interested in religion, and there are some people who are quite interested. In those days, it was most people were kind of, went to church, to mass from time to time. Some were really focused on it, either to the extent of becoming, part of a convent or a monastery or becoming a priest. So it was a sort of different stage, as it were. So he's a kind of fairly conventional Catholic, like many, many people in France at the time. But what happens to him at a particular period is that there's a story about how he goes out one winter's day. The story is told that he's meant to be he's meant to attend a duel between 2 gentlemen who've arranged to kind of shoot each other. And he was slightly underhand because that was meant to be banned at the time. Anyway, he was on his way to this and he slips over in the ice and does something to his hip, either breaks his hip or dislocates his hip. And so he comes home in a bit of a bad way. And so what you do at the time is you don't go to A&E, but you get what are called bone setters to come round and treat you. And so he looked up the local bone setters, and these 2 guys come and stay in the Pascal house for probably about a month or 2, just to kind of to give him medical treatment, to put his bones back in place and so on. But these people happen to be what are called Jansenists, which is a very strict movement of 17th century Catholicism. Again, we can talk about what they believed, and this was a significant moment for the family because they see their job not just as treating Etienne's hip, but also converting the family to Jansenism, which they do quite successfully, particularly for Pascal's younger sister, Jacqueline, and Blaise himself. So Jacqueline is the one who's most affected by them, and a bit Gilbert, the older sister. Blaise is drawn to that sort of form of faith. Etienne, kind of drawn to it, but still a little bit holding his distance. So that's kind of gives you a bit of the sort of map of the family religious outlook.
The beauty in this book, and I usually don't big people's books up this much on the show, actually. I hate when people do that performatively. But the beauty in this one is that it really fleshes out the human condition felt by anyone, specifically philosophers that we often dehumanize and just put into their ideas, and that's it. When obviously the ideas are downstream from the experiences they've felt.
Sure.
And especially someone that's had such a large impact on the world as Pascal. He's got all of these interesting factors that we can get into influencing his ideas. Speak to me about his health struggles early on.
Yeah. Well, Pascal is someone who struggled with poor health throughout his life. I mean, he died age 39. He didn't live very long. And he probably died of kind of stomach cancer, probably with secondaries in the brain because he had intense headaches. And through most of it, even in the early years, there's an episode that's told about him when he was young, where he nearly died because of an ailment that he had. There's a kind of story that it was all to do with a curse and a witch and all that kind of thing. But was it that, or was it, you can make your mind up on that. But all the way through his life, he basically struggled with poor health. And he actually said at one point, I never had a day in my adult life without some form of pain. And it kind of came and went. Sometimes it was an intense sickness that basically sent him to bed and he couldn't really sort of get up and be around. There's a famous time when he meets the philosopher René Descartes, who is a bit older than him, but Pascal is ill. He's in bed over the weekend and Descartes comes and visits him and so on. And there are other times when he was able to be up and around and, live a relatively normal life. So it came and went a bit, but he was always in some form of pain, especially towards the end of his life. And that was a big significant part of Pascal's reflection on the human condition. That he actually experienced a lot of pain. And of course, I suppose if he'd been living now, he would have had medical treatment, he'd have had anesthetics, he would have had, the cancer probably would have been diagnosed earlier, it might even have been treated, he might have lived a lot longer. But at the time, of course, not much could be done about that. And so again, we think of Pascal as someone who was unusually sick. And he probably was unusually sick even for that period. But we also have to recognize that at that time, that was a pretty common experience. That, people got ill and they experienced sickness and the mortality rate was a lot higher then than it was now. And so he's reflecting something that we probably don't think about quite so much, the prevalence of, especially in the West and other parts of the world, you do think about it a lot more. The prevalence of disease and sickness as a part of the human condition. But Pascal's very aware of that all the way through his life.
How does that impact his philosophy and how do you think that impacts our philosophy today, sat here in an air-conditioned studio?
Yeah. Well, I think it did affect his philosophy in the sense that he has a kind of a sense that the human experience is difficult. It's complicated. It's not straightforward. And it's actually full of pain. And pain is something you have to deal with. You can't just sort of push it to one side and ignore it doesn't exist. It's something that is there. Now, for him, strangely enough, he doesn't think of it as a thing that questions his belief in God. Partly because I think for most people at the time, it was just something that was just so prevalent. It was just around you all the time. You just accepted it as just the way things are. And I think it's more in our modern world where we've kind of been able to manage pain and put it to the margins that suddenly we think, well, pain is a bit of an anomaly in the world. Why is it here? Why does God allow it? All those kind of questions. Now, Pascal didn't really ask that question, nor did many of his contemporaries. That's a very modern question for us. And so I think it is that, and it does colour his view of the world. So if you compare him to someone like Voltaire, for example, he comes a little bit after Pascal. Voltaire is a sort of cheery kind of chap, who thinks that the future is bright and it's all going to be fine, and that's partly because his life is relatively untroubled. And I think Pascal's sickness probably did make him kind of identify with people who go through real struggles, whether mentally or physically. And so he's someone, I think, who is a philosopher and a thinker for people who know that life is complicated, it's difficult, it's often painful, it's not straightforward. He is someone, rather than for the person who thinks, yeah, life is fine, no problem at all, that I don't have to worry about questions like pain or difficulty or trauma.
So the Pascal family have moved to Paris, and this is going to make a massive impact on their lives.
Yeah.
But before we get to how this impacts their lives and how Pascal grows up for a few years in Paris, we've got a big thinker here at the time who's a bit of a celebrity in France, and that is René Descartes.
Yep.
What are his ideas that are most popular in the time, and how does he impact this whole unraveling situation with the Pascal family moving to Paris?
Yeah. Well, Descartes, as I say, is a little bit older than Blaise Pascal. They met once, as I say, when Pascal was ill, and Descartes tried to lecture Pascal on what he ought to do about his health, which didn't go down too well. You know what it's like when you're struggling and someone's trying to give you all kinds of advice.
And when they met once, they've led up to this for quite a few years.
Yeah, they did.
Pascal's been reading his work for a few years. He's always had quite the distaste for Descartes.
Exactly,
And after a few years, they finally meet. There's this anticipation. And
and the feeling's mutual.
How does that go?
Because Descartes thinks, who is this young upstart? And people have been sending him papers that he'd written, Blaise Pascal, and Descartes thinking, who is this guy? I'll put him in his place. There's a little bit of that going on. So Descartes' key ideas, I suppose two things you could focus on. One is, we're talking about the period after the Reformation. So the 16th century, you got the big Protestant Reformation. And as a result of that, you got these two forms of Christianity in Europe, Protestantism, Catholicism. And so it's kind of broken apart the kind of unified Christendom of the Western world. And the kind of questions, well, who's right? Who are the Protestants or the Catholics right? And this question about certainty, where can you find certainty? Where can you find something that you can be absolutely sure of? Is a kind of philosophical question that's around at the time. And of course, Descartes has a famous moment in, I think it's 1619, where he tries an experiment. He's a kind of mercenary soldier at the time, but a kind of amateur philosopher. And he climbs into a room and he gets his experiment. I'm not going to come out of this room until I can find something that I cannot doubt. And he tries to go through every idea that comes into his mind. Can I doubt that? Yeah, I can doubt it. I can put it to one side.
This is all unfolding in a furnace room, right?
Yeah, it's often called a stove-filled room. So what it was is the way rooms were heated in cold northern European houses. You'd have a big sort of stove in the corner where you'd sort of, there would be a fire in it, and it would basically heat the house. And so it was a room with a big stove in the corner. That's basically what it was. And so he didn't climb into a stove. He climbed into a room with a stove in it. You would have got rather hot otherwise. So he spends his time in this room with this mental experiment. What can I find that I cannot doubt? And what he arrives at is to think the thing that I cannot doubt is the fact that I'm thinking, the fact that I'm aware of myself. So the thinking self becomes the kind of basis of his philosophy. And he comes up with the most famous soundbite in Western European philosophical history, which is cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And he says, okay, that's the one thing I can be absolutely sure of, that I'm thinking. And so he says, okay, we can rebuild a philosophical system from that starting point. He then thinks, okay, the first idea that the thinking self kind of perceives outside itself is the idea of God. Again, think of he's working in the world of Christendom where the kind of idea of God is pretty universal. So he has a place for God, but it's almost as if the world has shifted at that point. So rather than God being at the center of the thing, God has slightly shifted to the edge and the thinking self has come into the middle of it. And so for him, the thinking self, the process of thinking, rationality, reason, that becomes the most important thing. And so he starts to think that actually becomes very confident in the power of human reason to understand everything, to control everything, to manage everything around. So he's supremely confident in reason. And that's the thing that got people very excited at the time. And the other thing about that is there is very strong in Descartes this kind of mind-body dualism. The
Flesh that out for me.
So, if you think about, we have minds, we have bodies, and in one way of thinking, we'd say, well, it's all kind of one thing. We are sort of, we're one thing, which is bodies that have minds within them. He makes a quite sharp distinction between them. For him, the body doesn't really matter that much. The body is kind of this is a material thing. What really matters is the mind. And so if you caricature it, you'd say we are basically brains on sticks. And that's kind of what Descartes is about, that he's this supremely confident in human reason and its capacity to master and understand the world. And so that's really the kind of key. There's a lot more to Descartes' philosophy than that, but that's the key idea you've got to get your head around, which Pascal reacts against. He doesn't really go down that line. And we can explore Pascal's ideas on reason in the same sort of way. But that's the kind of key idea of the Descartes. And so Pascal's already reacting to that, doesn't like it, doesn't think it works as a kind of way of thinking about the way in which human beings work. But Descartes and his followers are getting very excited about reason rather than revelation or the Bible or the church telling you how things are. No, reason tells you how things are.
Je pense donc je suis. That's about all the French I know.
Very good.
I've seen someone interpret it as I am thinking, therefore I am, rather than I think, therefore I am. Because you could have this illusion of having thought, whereas if you're thinking in that moment, you at least can't doubt that you exist.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. And therefore, the process of thinking becomes the most important thing about you. The fact that you can think, the fact that you are kind of aware of yourself, that's the kind of most important thing about humanity for Descartes. And that does shift the nature of the philosophical task. In some ways that, most of Western philosophy since then has been influenced by that single move. And you could argue that in recent times, in the move from the kind of more modern to the postmodern, we've kind of become a little bit less sure that thinking is the answer to everything. But that's very much for Descartes, that the thinking self, as you say, the fact that I'm thinking means I'm aware of myself, self-awareness. And it's a very kind of individual type of philosophy in that idea that the one thing I can be sure of is the fact that I'm thinking. There's no one else involved in that. I can be aware of my thinking. The fact that you're there or anybody else is in the room doesn't really matter that much. That's a secondary thing. It's the thinking self. And it kind of leads towards a more individualistic view of the world, I think, than someone like Pascal or others would have had later on.
Well, I think it's an important point to linger on before we get back into the Pascal action, because I see this permeating all of culture today. The majority of people I have, maybe it says something more about the friends I have rather than the average person, but the majority of friends I speak to, they genuinely buy into some idea of a simulation and just existing in a simulation. And it's, I think, therefore I am. They know that even if they're in a simulation, they're a brain in a vat, whatever it may be, they still exist. And therefore there's some sort of intrinsic value to that. But other than that, other than their own presence of mind, everyone else, they're not irrelevant because they're part of the world and that landscape that that brain in a vat operates within. But there is this decrease in empathy I've seen towards people by being skeptical of their existence. It's kind of actually, I'd call it Descartes' wager, this idea that you can't be certain that people actually exist, and it's more worthwhile when you exist to prioritize yourself.
Sure. And there's a philosopher, Charles Taylor, this Canadian philosopher, who talks about what he calls about the subjective turn in modern culture, which he kind of locates around Descartes, Locke, Kant, and others. And I suppose because the next stage on with this is you've got Descartes saying it's the thinking self, me thinking about myself. That's what gives me an assurance that I exist. That's the one thing I can be sure of. Kant goes a stage beyond that to say, well, can you be sure of what you see out there? The fact that you're there, I've got an image of you in my mind, but can I be really sure that you really are there? Or is that just an image that I've got in my mind? All I can be sure of is my own subjectivity. And it kind of turns you into yourself. And I think that's quite problematic in all kinds of ways. And I think you're right. It is very typical of modern life that we kind of look inside ourselves to find out who our identity is. And then we kind of, we are primarily individuals who then might, if we want to, develop relationship with other people or with the wider world outside. But a lot of it goes back to that turn that Descartes makes back in the early 17th century.
I've seen people mentioning this fleetingly, but I think they miss out that core psychological element, not to psychoanalyze people too much, but I think that really plays into it. And I can imagine if I had that same thought process, I would be like this, which is I'm uncertain that you actually exist and that your feelings are that of a human person. I can't doubt that I exist. Therefore, it's me, baby, all the way.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. That's the kind of the outcome of the longer term trajectory of the Descartes position, that shifting of the focus of things. And it's very interesting, Pascal himself talks about the self, which is a really interesting thing, the self, le moi, is what it is in French. And he talks in very strong terms about how you actually need to hate yourself. That's that language. Now, that's very uncomfortable for us. But he sees this trajectory towards it's me, baby, at the end of the day, and actually thinks it's quite destructive. It doesn't really build a good human life or a good human society, or it's not actually true to the way things are. And actually, he says we need a radical change from that. But, we can get into that a little bit later on. But I think it's exactly right. I think you put your finger on it, that's where that goes. It goes to say, well, I can't be sure about anything out there. I can't be sure about anybody else out there. What I can be sure about is myself. And therefore, I am the center of the universe.
Something that speaks to this as well is this idea of being human and the inherent value we all place on human experience. There's the classic infinite pleasure machine thought experiment in philosophy, where you're offered a choice to enter this experience and it's unlimited pleasure, just the best feeling you've ever felt. And I can't remember if the experiment goes on to say it's eternal or not. But the point being, you can feel this incredible pleasure right now, better than you could ever experience on Earth in your human corporeal form. But the catch is, it's a simulation and it's not reality. And people seem to be very hesitant to engage with that because there's something about your experience and your achievements in life actually being in human form rather than simulated. How does this play into all of this?
And I think that instinct or that hesitation to take the bet, or at least to go down that line is I think evidence for that we kind of feel that we need to have some purchase on reality beyond ourselves. It can't just be a game, a simulation, which doesn't really exist in any sort of objective way. We kind of have a need to connect with something beyond ourselves, which is kind of real. And we would feel very dissatisfied if actually what if we ultimately decided that all that we knew is simply a simulation. It's the kind of Truman Show thing. In that film where he just discovers the whole thing is a simulation, and he can't live like that. You kind of have to break out to make some connection with reality beyond. And it seems to me that, and one of the things I often think of is, one of my other great heroes besides Pascal is Martin Luther, the great sort of German reformer. And one of the things he said was that we have this human tendency. He talked about this, the Christian idea of sin, which is not a very popular word, but he describes it as the heart turned in upon itself. Cor incurvatus in se is the Latin phrase. The heart turned in upon itself. And whereas actually what we really need as human beings is to be turned out of ourselves towards other people, towards the world, towards God. Actually what this thing called sin does is to turn us inwards, to just focus upon ourselves. And then by turning inwards, it's a bit like a sort of flower turning away from the sun. You ultimately sort of shrivel and die, as it were, if you don't have that purchase, that connection with something real beyond yourself. And so I think that's where that plays into it a bit.
I want to press you on this a little bit more, and you're going to give a different answer to me as a Christian about why we feel this inherent value that we then place on human existence and real experience. It actually happened. Because from my perspective, I can imagine that this is an evolved instinct and that real life matters because if we butt up against reality, we won't survive. So right now, as I see it, we're going against our evolutionary wiring, and that's probably going to come at some pretty severe costs. I mean, you see suicide rates going up and this sort of cult of individualism that we can speak about later. It seems contrary to how we were evolved and how we've survived so far on the planet. I mean, you can argue that is but I suppose in terms of that, you kind of think, well, why? Because if evolution is about survival, it's about enabling the species to exist in the longer term. Is it purely about that? Is it purely about a survival mechanism? And why would a connection with something outside ourselves make us more or less likely to survive? And so I guess I wonder whether there's something a bit more to it than that it's not just a kind of evolutionary process that we've developed
in order to kind of make sure that our species survives over against other species. That it is actually a reflection of the way we were originally made. And this is again what Pascal talks about. I mean, he actually talks about the idea of happiness, back to your sort of pleasure image. Pascal talks about happiness quite a lot. And he talks about how humans, everybody wants to be happy, without exception. Every human being wants to be happy. And he says but the problem is that, we find happiness, but it's pretty fleeting. We find it for a moment and it lasts a little bit. If any of the golf fans watching, you might have seen that recent interview with Scotty Scheffler, who's the number one golfer in the world. And he did this extraordinary interview where he said, well, I sometimes wonder why I play this game, because I go into these tournaments and I win a tournament and it feels great for 10 minutes, but then I'm back to normal again. And that is a very Pascalian thing. It's a very human thing that, we find happiness, but then it slips away from us. It's like trying to grasp water in your hands. It just doesn't last. And so Pascal says, well, we've got that instinct to seek happiness, but why do we think there is such a thing as happiness when it's so fleeting? It's so sort of evanescent, especially given his own sort of experience of pain over his life. And he says, well, we only sense the lack of something that we once possessed. One of his lines says, nobody mourns the fact they haven't got 3 eyes, but someone who is blind is inconsolable. So in other words, if you lose your sight of 2 eyes, which you once had, which is normal for human beings, then you feel, why haven't I got this thing? But no one thought I haven't got 3 eyes, because we've never had 3 eyes. His point being that we once had a happiness. We once had this face-to-face encounter with the God who made us. We have a memory, a kind of corporate memory as human beings of this thing called happiness, and we're constantly seeking for it, constantly trying to find it. And every now and again we touch it, we taste it through, a friendship or a relationship or a kind of, a view of a sunset on a summer's night or some sporting achievement. We find some middle of happiness, but then it vanishes from us. It's a very evocative way of saying, well, these things are not just kind of evolutionary developments. They are actually telling us something about who we are and what we were made for and where we came from originally.
Do you think prioritizing the self over-indexes and prioritizes happiness?
Do you mean?
Do you think that happiness is sort of, and prioritizing happiness too much is always downstream from individualism, or do you think that the two can sort of?
No, I don't think they are, because I think certainly Pascal and his great theological hero St. Augustine don't think seeking happiness is a bad thing. Actually, Pascal doesn't think we shouldn't seek happiness. We should be miserable all the time. He actually thinks that the desire to be happy is a right and proper human thing. And it's something he thinks is implanted in us by God. It's a yearning for true contentment, for true happiness. And this feeds into what Pascal says about this theme of what he calls distraction, that we are almost too easily pleased. We're too easily pleased by, winning a golf game or, winning the lottery or just, seeing a nice view or whatever it is. Whereas actually there's a deeper and more lasting and constant happiness to be found in a kind of encounter in a relationship with the God who made us. So he actually thinks that the search for happiness is absolutely right and proper. It's not an offshoot of self-centeredness. There's a right. The question is, where do we find that happiness? And his diagnosis is that the kind of Descartes line tells you that you'll be happy if you prioritize yourself, if you find the things that give you pleasure. And Pascal says, that doesn't work that way.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key piece in all of this.
Yeah.
I see this today, and quickly, I think I differ with Pascal on the fact that we're pleased too easily, because I think it's important to be grateful for the small things. Yep. The missing piece being having some sort of North Star that you're working towards that actually fulfills you. But otherwise you will be miserable even working towards that North Star if you can't be grateful for the here and now and the sort of small magical moments along the way. But what I see today is we certainly have a sort of culture of individualism now, and people are always seeking happiness rather than fulfillment. And as you said, maybe the two aren't mutually exclusive, but there's something very interesting in the fact that, at least now, people that always seek happiness. I mean, there was this great study where people in the UK and the West, they tried to get happier by just making themselves happier. They just said, I'm just going to try to be happier, and that will lead me to happiness.
Yep.
And they didn't get happier.
Yep.
Whereas people in Russia and some of Southeast Asia, Taiwan, they tried to get happier, and they actually became happier. And one of the key distinctions that Johann Hari speaks about with this idea in his book Lost Connections is that those in Russia and in Taiwan and the rest of Southeast Asia, they had a much more family-oriented view on life. Whereas the people in the West, to get happiness, they prioritized themselves. They looked within because I think, therefore I am. And they didn't get happier because all the things they were doing were buying watches or trying to get more status in a career rather than moving perhaps closer to home for happiness.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Why Being Yourself is a Bad Idea. And the idea of it was basically that, that one of the core things in modern life is, be yourself. That's the kind of number one command. I've been told it many times, and, it's the kind of heart of every Disney film and everything else. Just be yourself. Whereas it seems to me that's actually quite a confusing bit of advice, because it assumes that I know who I am. It assumes that there is this inner pure self inside that, and I've just got to be that. But actually, there's all kinds of stuff going on inside me, some of which I'm quite happy to let you see, some of which I don't want you to see. That's true of all of us. And so ourselves are much more complex than that. And therefore, the advice to be yourself, in other words, to look inside yourself, to find out who you really are and then express that, it's just the wrong place to look. It's just turning you inside yourself instead of being turned outwards, as I say, towards other people, towards God, which is kind of what that survey suggests. And in fact, actually, Pascal, I think what Pascal would say about it is he says at one point, the sole cause of man's unhappiness is his inability to stay alone in a room. And you got to think about that for a while. You think, I don't know if you ever tried sitting in a room with no book, no phone, no radio, no TV, nothing for an hour. It's pretty difficult. And he says that is the heart of our problem. And we look for anything just to distract us. And we are the most distracted age of them all, because we have these machines in our pockets that give us constant entertainment, information, and so on. So we are the most distracted generation and age there's ever been. And so, even more than Pascal's age. But he knew that in his own time. But just before that, which is one of Pascal's famous quotes, that one there. But just before that, he says something like this. He says, in order to stop thinking about our wretchedness, our ignorance, our pain, and our misery, we've decided, in order to be happy, not to think about these things, and instead to remain at that level of kind of, I think, what he would call a sort of self-centered kind of distraction. And he actually thinks that counterintuitively, you've got to almost give up that bit of seeking to be happy through these distracted things, to search for a deeper kind of happiness, which actually means by going to he actually thinks there's a deeper sickness in the human condition, which is this radical self-centeredness. And that has to be addressed first before you can really break through to a true contented happiness.
One of the key words used online nowadays is authenticity.
Yeah.
Being your authentic self.
Yeah.
And especially in relationships, and you see dating coaches saying that you should show up as your authentic self, right? In front of your partner.
Yeah.
Where is the line here between being authentic and misconstruing what the self is?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting one, because I can remember, as a teenager going out for a date with a girl I quite liked at the time, and I remember, going to that same conversation, go to a friend saying, what should I do? And you said, just be yourself. That's the kind of advice you get. And I can remember thinking, actually, the last thing I want to do when I meet this girl is to be myself. Because if she sees the kind of, insecurities and fears and jealousies and all kind of stuff going on in my mind, there will not be a second date. So actually what we do is we cultivate a kind of acceptable version of ourselves, and we present that, and we hide the other bits that we're not quite so sure about, and we don't want other people to see. And so I think there's this thing about, what is the authentic self? And I suppose I tend to think that ourselves are more created and formed rather than discovered. In other words, when you ask me the question, who am I? In some ways, I don't know yet. I'm still being shaped. I'm still being formed, even at my advanced age. You're quite a bit younger than me, but you are being shaped. Who you are will be determined by the kind of decisions you make, the things you commit yourself to, the relationships you enter into. Those are the things that shape us and form us and make us who we are. And over time, you develop a kind of settled sense of the self. And so I think when the self is a more complex thing than we think it is. I think Pascal would say that. There is the self there's that self within me that wants everybody to admire me and think I'm wonderful and tells me I'm great and tells me my books are wonderful. And there's that self. But there's this other self which is capable of a deep happiness by finding security in relationship with other people and with the God who made me, that is secure enough not to need all that kind of affirmation from other people. And there's that kind of very selfish self, and there's that other self. And in Christian terms, in the Bible, St. Paul talks about the old self and the new self. The old self, which is this self-centered, I want everything for myself, it's me, baby. But then there's the new self in Christ, which he talks about, which is this new self being shaped by relationship with Jesus Christ, the one human being that shows us what it really is to be truly human. And those selves have to be disentangled and discern within you. So the self is a more complex thing than we think it is.
How does the approach towards looking at the self differ throughout history, without asking too much of you to give a comprehensive guide? But even just looking at my own experience, and this has been really hard to realize and feel. And I feel even like a little bit uncomfortable speaking about it almost. Yeah. It feels like I'm exposing a friend, but that friend is me. Yeah. I feel like I have a true self that I feel within. Yeah. That is the urge when I want to eat some Haribos when I'm on a diet. The true urge within that says, no, don't do that. Yeah. That's my true self. Yeah. And it feels distinctly different. Yeah. I don't know what's at play there, but it's just interesting that I always feel I have two different levels of thought. I have the deeper, real connection to myself where I really feel comfortable with that voice. Yeah. I feel like that's what I want. It's aligned with me, Elliot, and it's what I really think. Sure. Then layered on top of that, I kind of have these more shallow thoughts, more tied viscerally to emotions and impulses.
Yeah, and that kind of illustrates, in some ways, I think what I'm saying about the complexity of the self. There actually may be a number of Elliots in there, a number of voices that are going on. And the question is which one you feed, which one you nurture within yourself, because you could feed that voice that says, just eat the Haribos, eat the Mars bars, eat, that's a terrible example, but that's one thing. But there is a voice inside us that actually, if we follow that voice, it's going to be quite destructive for us. And but then there are other voices that lead us in different directions. And I suppose what the kind of Christian take on that, and I think this is what Pascal would say, is that you've got to have some. What kind of self do you want to aspire to be? If we are selves that are being created over time, we're being shaped, we're being formed by the influences upon us, by the things we commit ourselves to, what can you find is the best thing to commit yourself to? What is the image of a human being? Do you think, that's what I want to be? That's where I want to go. That's my North Star. That's the kind of person I want to be around. And for me as a Christian, that is Jesus Christ. And that's why I want to try and follow him. Doesn't mean I get it always right. Those voices are still inside me that say, no, that's the way you want to go. But that's the way I think the Christian thinks about the self. The self is being formed. It's being shaped over time. And the North Star to which we try and aspire to is this figure of Jesus Christ who gives himself totally to other people, even to the point of going to a cross for the sake of the human race, rising again after that.
Let's get back to Pascal.
Pascal.
He's in Paris. He's growing up rapidly. What is he doing? What's he publishing in terms of work? He's moving in certain circles intellectually. What's going on?
Yeah, well, he moves to Paris, and as he grows up, he joins a sort of circle of intellectuals, scientists, philosophers, led by a man called Marin Mersenne, who was a friar in a kind of religious order, but a bit of an intellectual at the time. He's quite a well-known figure that Pascal's father is part of. He brings young Pascal along. Pascal reads a paper he's done on a sort of mathematical question, which everyone's quite wowed by, and that paper gets sent on to Descartes, and that's partly why Descartes gets a bit cross, because he thinks this young upstart, he's taking my glory. And as Pascal grows up beyond that, what he's really known for at his time is really as a scientist. He's not known as a theologian or a philosopher or someone who's writing about Christianity. He's more known as someone who engages in a number of mathematical, geometrical questions at the time. He gets particularly well known for an experiment he did on the existence of the vacuum. Until that point, people felt that there's no such thing as a vacuum on various philosophical grounds. And even Descartes thought that because there can be no such thing as nothing. There's always something. So a vacuum is filled with something that appears to be a vacuum is something else. Anyway, Pascal actually unusually for his time, takes an experimental approach to science. You should do the experiment, look at the evidence, see what the evidence tells you, find the best explanation of that experiment and of that evidence, and you should go with that. And so he does these series of experiments, which involve carrying large tubes of mercury and buckets and bowls all the way up a mountain to take measurements on the height of mercury in a tube and all the way back down again. In fact, he can't do it because he's ill at the time, and he gets his brother-in-law and a kind of group of others to do this thing. And he measures, they measure the height of the mercury all the way up the mountain and back down again. It's all about atmospheric pressure. It's all about the existence of the vacuum. And he goes ahead and he publishes the results of this experiment, and it's been called the first truly modern experiment in European history. In other words, something where the experiment was measured very carefully. It was published for others to read and to kind of examine, and that goes viral around Europe. He becomes famous for this particular experiment, which pretty well proves that two things. It proves that there is such a thing as a vacuum, and that air has weight. In other words, the air weighs something. It's not just nothing. And so, he's known as this scientist. He gets involved in some mathematical things. So he has a correspondence with Pierre de Fermat. You might have heard of Fermat's last theorem, great mathematician, 17th century. They have this correspondence on probability. What happens is Pascal has a lot of friends who are kind of, sophisticated people who go to the salons in Paris. They're into witty conversation. They're into impressing people. They go gambling. They play tennis. They go hunting. They're interested in all that kind of stuff. And one of them is a gambler who sets Pascal a problem. He says, look, if you have a game, maybe it's a game of cards or a game of tossing coins, and it lasts a long time, people have put in their stakes and they're betting on the game at the beginning of it, and the game gets interrupted halfway through. How do you allocate the stake? In other words, how do you work out what might have happened as a result of that game? And Pascal and Fermat work on this, and they come up with a theory, which is basically the origins of probability theory. And so these are the kind of things that Pascal's involved with during this middle period of his life.
What comes next? I want us to jump forwards a little bit. He grows up, the family moving back and forth.
Yep.
He helps out his dad, who's now filing tax for the state, who's struggling with counting all of this money. Talk to me about that invention from Pascal.
Well, he watches his dad trying to get the tax sums right. He's a tax official in Rouen. And in France, and tax is quite a controversial thing at the time, because the king was trying to raise funds for his external wars. The taxes were very unpopular. There were kind of riots about it in the streets, and so being a tax collector was not a popular profession. And so Blaise Pascal gets, he sees the stress on his father, and he thinks, how can I help him? Because obviously if he gets the sums wrong and imposes too much tax on people, they get really cross, and you get riots and everything else. And so he thinks, maybe I can invent a machine that does these calculations a bit quicker and better than you can do it in your head. And so he invents this thing called the Pascaline, which is basically one of the first effective mechanical calculators in European history. And it can count up to hundreds and thousands of millions. And it's a series of dials, kind of carefully sort of engineered thing, which he's got people to make. He designs it himself. He puts the bits together. He gets artisans in the town where he lives to kind of make this thing. It's never a great business success. He tries to make a lot of them and sell them, but they're too expensive, and so no one really buys them. But it's a very successful machine in the sense that it's kind of still remembered today. There are still a number of them you can see in museums around France in particular. They're beautiful things. They're actually like a little box like this, with lots of dials on the top, and you kind of work the dials along, and it's very, very clever. And it actually worked. And you could do sophisticated calculations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, up to, as I say, hundreds of millions, in a pretty accurate way, much quicker than doing it in your head, and much more accurate. And it's often been thought of as one of the precursors of the modern calculator and therefore the modern computer. So I often think, when you open your laptop and you do your work on your computer, you kind of think of Pascal, because when the story of computers is told, very often the Pascaline is one of the stages, the very first kind of mechanical calculator, digital calculator that actually worked, and that was a step towards the calculator and the computer in the longer term.
It's crazy just thinking about this aptitude he has for thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
You've got numbers as this concept that's all mental, and you're adding them up, and he takes them into this physical form.
Yeah.
And that might sound really trivial because we kind of just can't get out of our heads the fact that we have calculators now.
Yeah.
But it just makes me wonder what we think about now that we think we can only think about, that are later going to be put into systems, perhaps for good or bad. So Pascal's making all of these crazy inventions. He's a mathematician. He's messing around with probability very successfully. He's doing experiments. One of the key parts that I think make up, or at least form, our understanding of Pascal today is the Provincial letters.
Yeah.
Talk to me about those. This seems like one of his first ventures into a more philosophical, theological approach to things.
Yeah. Well, an important precursor to the Provincial letters, and again, we may talk in detail about it in time, is this event that happens to him in November 1654, which is called the Night of Fire, which seems to have been a very powerful, visceral kind of religious experience for him, where he says for 2 hours on one particular night, he seems to have had this encounter with God, which didn't change everything, but it changed the whole way he thought about his life. I think until that point, I think there's always been two things going on in Pascal's mind. He's got this very religious sister. He's got his family influenced by this Jansenist movement, which is, and they tended to think, you must either choose God or the world. And they were a bit suspicious about Pascal because he was this famous mathematician and physicist. And they always thought, well, if you're really serious about God, you've got to leave all that stuff behind and go and join a monastery, which is kind of what Jacqueline, his sister, had done. And I think he was always sort of struggling with this, what do I do, God or the world? That was the options that were given to him by this Jansenist movement. Now, he has this experience in 1654, which shifts the ground. Doesn't mean he gives up on the world entirely. He still does mathematical work. He still does experiments, but they take a lesser place in his life, and it sort of resolves a bit of a religious question for him. Anyway, one of the results of that is that he kind of throws his lot in with the Jansenists, which is this group of Christians in 17th century France who kind of think that the rest of the kind of Christian world in France, particularly the Jesuits, they're a bit soft on religion, really. And I think what's at the heart of it is that the Jesuits are kind of saying, well, we've got to make it easy to be a Christian. There's all these sophisticated people who go gambling and hunting, and the people that Pascal's friends. How can we make it easy for them to be Christian? And so they kind of stretch the tent and say, well, it's kind of okay if you just go to church every now and again, if you kind of turn up, and even if you don't stay for the whole service, you sort of nod in the direction of the priest, and you say the odd prayer every now and again. Occasionally you might feel sorry for the sins that you commit. That's enough. That's all right. That's enough. And Pascal says, no, it's not enough. Actually, that's not going to make you happy. that's actually going to make you miserable, because you're going to have not enough of the world to make you happy in that kind of surface sense, but certainly not enough of God to make you happy in the deeper sense. And he says, if you're really going to be Christian, there has to be what he calls repentance. There has to be this real change of heart, this radical shift from the self-centered life to the God-centered life. Anyway, in this big debate going on between the Jesuits and the Jansenists, and the Jesuits are basically winning the argument. The Jesuits are very powerful. The king is in favor of the Jesuits. The king's confessor is a Jesuit priest. The Jesuits are much more powerful than the Jansenists. The Jansenists are a kind of small group. And there's a meeting that happens quite soon after Pascal's Night of Fire, where they're all sitting around. They're a bit fed up and glum because they're losing the argument. And the main guy, who's the leader of the Jansenists, my Antoine Arnaud, has been writing these long, complicated theological treatises on why they're right and the Jesuits are wrong. And they're not getting anywhere. And it seems like the Pope has condemned Jansenism, and it's not going very well. And at one point they turn to Pascal and they say that you're young, can't you do something? And Pascal goes away, and a few days later he comes back and he reads them the beginnings of basically one of the greatest works of satirical literature, certainly in French literary history, perhaps even in Europe. And Pascal's genius is that what he does is he basically approaches this conflict not through complicated philosophy or theology, but through comedy. And he's a genius at it. And what he does is he writes a series of letters purportedly from a Parisian gentleman to a friend out in the sticks, in the provinces, therefore the provincial letters, just describing the debate and showing how, in a very, very clever, still very funny way, even today, even when the kind of disputes are kind of lost in the mist of time, it's still quite funny to read. It's brilliant. And so that's what the Provincial Letters were. That's his first foray into sort of theological debate. And at the heart of it, I think, is his kind of sense that actually real religion means real change of heart. A surface religion, which is just about nodding in the direction of God, isn't really worth the candle. So, yeah.
He has to publish these provincial letters anonymously to protect himself. Mm. He's taking a big risk here when he keeps on publishing them. I think there's a story of him almost getting caught with his friends publishing these letters, and he sort of sneaks out with the machine to avoid them getting caught by the Jesuits and them seeing that they had the printing machine to print these letters. He's taking a big risk here. Mm. You've mentioned the Night of Fire. Mm. To get him to the point of taking such a big risk, this must have been a pretty profound experience.
Yeah, it was. Exactly. Yeah. It was a big risk. And it's a great story, of him hiding in cupboards and people finding the printing presses and the printing presses themselves, having to move the equipment all over the time. But you're right. Yeah. I mean, the heart of it is this Night of Fire. And I think it was a strange thing because he never told anybody about it. It was clearly a really important experience for him. And people kind of knew at the time something had happened, but he never told a soul. And the only reason that people know about it is that when he died, one of the servants who was preparing his body for burial cut open his jacket and felt something in the lining. And they opened up the jacket and they pulled out these two bits of paper, one's paper, one's parchment, on which were written two versions of basically the same. It's kind of like a poem. And it's a very powerful poem. Actually, I might read a bit of it because it just gives you a sense of what this is about. And at the top of the page, it has the word fire. And then it says, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned. Certitude, feeling, joy, peace. God of Jesus Christ, my God and your God will be my God. And it kind of goes on in that note, and it's clearly a very powerful experience of joy, of a sense of certainty, not intellectual certainty, but a kind of spiritual certainty that he's encountered someone outside himself. And it's not the God of the philosophers. It's not the God of Descartes. It's not a God who is the product of a logical process of argumentation. It's not the God of, the Jesuits, a God who is sort of distant that you just nod at every now and again. No, this is a God who is intensely interested in you, who has to kind of almost consume your whole being and be the center of your life from that point onwards. And so it is a very powerful experience for him. And I think people looking back when they read about this, and he dates it very precisely, November the 23rd, 1654. I think people, his friends, who look back, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense of what that shift that we'd perceived in his life. That's why he got involved in the Provincial letters. That's why he got involved with the Jansenists. That's why he started writing the Pensée. And so it made sense of so much afterwards, even though he never said anything at the time.
Eventually we get from this to Pascal's second conversion, as they call it.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what people could talk about Pascal's first conversion as being his sort of first encounter with Jansenism when his dad had the accident and the Jansenist bone setters came to the family. And at that stage, he was sort of drawn to the Jansenists. He had a kind of burst of enthusiasm. It's kind of young, a bit naive, a bit. And one of Pascal's less attractive characteristics was when he got into an argument, he liked to win. And he would sort of pummel his adversaries. And he was very bright. You wouldn't want to get into an argument with Pascal because you would not win it. And he would pummel you into submission. And that was not an attractive thing. And he did that a few times in his early days as a kind of, enthusiastic Jansenist. But after that first conversion, there's a sense in which he kind of loses a bit of that fire. He gets more interested in the kind of science and the mathematics. Then his second conversion is this night of fire, this profound experience of God that sets him on a new trajectory. And I think the two impacts of that, three things I could say about it. One is that I think, let's say, it didn't entirely get rid of the physics and the mathematics. They still happened. He still was interested in that, but it took a lesser place in his life. It wasn't the center of who he was. He was no longer Pascal, the famous scientist. Because I think what it was at its heart is that was the moment, if you like it, he made that shift that actually himself, back to the point about the self and the self-centeredness, his own self had shifted to one side, which is the opposite of Descartes. Descartes, I feel like, had shifted God out of the center and put himself in the middle. This is the moment where Pascal puts himself out of the center and puts God in the middle of his life. And so there's that sense of shifting the center of gravity of his own person, his own self, and who he is. And it issues in two things. One is a desire to enable these sophisticated, trendy friends of his who go to the salons and, engage in the conversations and so on. He wants to say, how can I help them discover that they will only find true happiness, not in gambling and playing tennis and being admired by everybody, but in an encounter with God? How can I persuade them to take God seriously? Because they think God is boring. They think God is not very interesting at all. That's the one thing. The second thing, he gets fascinated by poverty, and he becomes very devoted to the poor people of Paris, poor people in France generally. He starts giving away a lot of his possessions. He starts living a very austere life. And he ends his life in voluntary destitution. Basically, he owns almost nothing. And he lives in a very kind of bare room in the middle of Paris. And so, and he says, I love poverty because Jesus Christ loved poverty. He felt that was something that he was drawn to see what he could do to help the poor. So those two things, trying to help his sophisticated, wealthy friends to find God, but also to serve the poor. Those are the two things that really came out of that experience, I think.
What was Pascal's wager?
Yeah. Well, Pascal's wager is something that lots of people have thought about. It's, philosophers think about it quite a bit. And it comes in, so one of the things he did when he had this night of fire, I think, okay, I need to try and think about how I'm going to persuade my friends. And he was going to write a book which would hopefully explain Christian faith and draw people into Christian faith. He never finished it because he died too young. But what he did leave behind was a whole realm of papers, some of which are sort of a line, some are paragraphs, some which are a little bit longer. And they were collected together after he died, published as the Pensée, the Thoughts of Pascal. Now, one of these is a fairly long piece of work, which is actually not called The Wager. It's called Infini Rien, Infinity Nothing. That's the title he gives it. And it contains an argument which has become famous in philosophy. And in kind of popular terms, it's often thought of as basically saying, look, you might as well believe in God because you've got a lot to lose if you don't believe in God. You've got a lot to gain if you do. Putting it at its simplest. And a lot of philosophers have criticized the idea for all kinds of reasons. Well, it doesn't necessarily prove the God of Christianity. You could say that about Islam or Judaism or Hinduism. People have said, well, it's a bit arm's length as an argument. It feels a bit selfish. It's all about my own, what my own salvation or whatever. But I actually think it's not an argument that is trying to strong-arm people into belief in God. What it's there to try and do is to try to show people the real reasons why they believe or don't believe. And I think the way it works is like this. It's like, I was talking about, earlier on we talked about these games of chance, where he and Fermat did the probability thing. And it's kind of like that. So I think it would have come in the course of a conversation with a friend. And the friend is someone who is maybe just thinking about God as a possibility. God might be there, God might not be there, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. And Pascal is talking to this person. And this guy says to Pascal, well, should I believe or should I not? Pascal says, well, you should believe, and you've got to bet one way or the other. And the guy says, well, do I have to bet? And Pascal says, well, you do, because you've already bet. You're already living your life as if God exists or as if God doesn't exist. So you've already cast your bet one side or the other. The question is, do you change your mind? And so the guy says, okay, well, if I've got a bet, is there any evidence that would push me one way or the other? And Pascal says, well, there is. There's some good evidence for believing in God, but there's stuff that might push you in the other direction. And he says the evidence is not so much as to convince you. You realize there's stuff on both sides of this. And so then the guy says, well, what do I do then? And then that's when Pascal says, well, let's do the probability on this. And so he does, okay, what's the probability now? Okay, if you believe in God, the probability goes like this, that if you win, if you believe in God and you're right, then you stand to gain eternal life at the end of the day, happiness, eternal happiness in the presence of God. If you're wrong, well, you haven't lost a great deal. Maybe a little bit of sacrifice in this life, but you haven't lost a great deal, but you stand to gain a great prize. If you believe that God doesn't exist, and you're right, well, you haven't gained a great deal, maybe a few more games of tennis and a few gambling games and so on, but it's very short for a period of time. If you're wrong, you could stand to lose quite a lot, eternal damnation and so on. And so he says, and I think this is the point of the wager. He says, if you're really being rational, if you're really doing the probability, you'd always bet on God because you stand so much to gain through believing, and you and you stand to lose a lot for that. So you'd always bet on God. But then the guy comes back and says, well, yeah, but I can't make myself believe something I don't feel. And that's where Pascal says, yeah, I get that. I get you can't do that. But he says, this is the point of the wager, but at least get it into your head that the reason you do not believe is not because of your reason, because of your passions. So that's, I think, the point he's driving at. He's not strong-arming people into belief. He's trying to uncover the fact that the real reasons that push us towards belief or unbelief are not rational. They're actually more to do with our desires, our longings, our heart, what he calls the heart. And that's when the guy says, okay, well, what do I do then? And Pascal says, well, his advice is, well, start living as if it's true. Even if you don't believe it, start living as if it's true. Start going through every day as if God really is there, that you talk to him as if he really, even if you're not sure he is there. Start praying. Start reading the Bible as if it is God's word to you. Start every day. Start going to a church as if it really is the place where God's people are gathered, and you learn a new way of life. Start living the Christian life, and then it might fall into place for you. So I think that's basically what the wager is.
From this, and I don't know about the chronology on this, one of Blaise Pascal's most famous lines, the heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing.
Yeah.
I think that ties all of this in quite nicely.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a line that's often misunderstood because it sounds like, follow your heart in the kind of, Disney film thing, just do your thing, which is exactly not what it doesn't mean. That's more Descartes than it is Pascal. For Pascal, the heart is kind of like a deep instinct that grasps things that cannot be grasped by reason. So he says there are certain things that you can't reason yourself towards. So things like number, things like space, things like time. You can't reason yourself towards those things. We just experience them as being there. We have this instinct that just grasps them. At the beginning of the wager, he has this thing about the concept of infinity. He says, well, infinity is something, we don't know much about infinity. We don't even know whether it's an odd number or an even number. But we kind of sense there is this thing called infinity, the biggest number you can ever think of. So he says it's possible to think about something that exists, but you don't know much about it. And it's kind of like that with God, he says. So what he says, that God is perceived by the heart and not the reason. This is his thing about not the God of the philosophers. And what he's saying is that God is not an object that you can kind of put in a test tube and analyze and ask, is there evidence for it? Which is the biggest mistake I think a lot of sort of atheists like Richard Dawkins and so on, they make. They kind of say, well, where's the evidence for God? Now, I can say, where's the evidence for this book, or where's the evidence for this glass of water, or where's the, and I can give an account of how that came into being. I can, tell the story of how this book came into being, or that glass of water, whatever it might be, because it's an event, it's a thing within this space-time universe. Pascal says, and again, he says it towards the beginning of the wager, God is not that kind of being. He's not an event within the world. He's not a thing within the world that is subject to the normal processes of proof. He's outside that system. And therefore, you cannot access him through reason. Now, there are reasons you can give that might point you in the direction of God, miracles, prophecies, and so on. But they're not conclusive, he says, because ultimately, that ultimate decision about the most important decision we make as human beings is not made by our reason, it's made by our hearts.
What do you think is the most important idea from Pascal and his pensées?
I think the most important idea for Pascal is that we find our true happiness by encountering the God who made us. And we can only find that through a radical change in the heart and this displacement of ourselves as the center of everything towards God as the center of everything. That's the thing I think he's driving at. He's trying to kind of wean us away from this illusion that somehow we will find happiness through pleasure, through sort of fleeting things that we think are going to bring us happiness. And we will only find happiness by stripping away that layer of distractions, the things that we think are going to give us happiness, to go deeper to the thing that really will give us happiness, which is the kind of thing that happened to him on the night of fire, that encounter with the God who made us, the God who shows himself to us in Jesus Christ, the God who is this hidden God, which is another big theme of Pascal, that if there is a God, he must be a hidden God because he's not obvious. That's the great thing about Pascal. He loves the paradoxes, the weirdness of Christianity. It's not obvious. Christianity is not obviously true. There isn't obviously a God. He doesn't speak to you out of the clouds. He doesn't suddenly appear to you in the middle of the road. If there is a God, there's a hidden God. But that's a very generative idea, the idea that there may be this God who is hidden. And Pascal says, actually, that makes sense of Christianity, because actually that's exactly what Christianity says. If there is a God, there must be a hidden God. Well, Christianity says that when God came to us, he came to us in hidden form. In other words, he came to us in this person called Jesus Christ. That you could meet Jesus, you could shake his hand and entirely miss the fact that you were talking to God, because he's hidden in the flesh of Jesus. Same he says in church. You go to church and you get given a bit of bread and wine. Looks like bread and wine. Looks like ordinary stuff. But actually, says Pascal, no, this is the body and blood of Christ. Always, he says in Christianity, this is a hidden God. And that kind of makes sense of our experience of the world, that if there is a God, he's a hidden God.
How do you reconcile that divine hiddenness with God being omnibenevolent?
Well, for Pascal, I think the way he would say that is that God is not interested in a kind of arm's length relationship with us. The kind of relationship that says, okay, I believe God exists, tick that box, get on with the rest of my life. Which is why God doesn't show himself to be obvious. Why God, if you like, hides himself from us, because he waits to be found by those who are not content with that kind of relationship with God, who are willing to go deeper into that deeper encounter that Pascal himself had. So it's a kind of expression of God's benevolence in the fact that that's what he longs for us, to have that deep encounter with God. And therefore he doesn't allow us to just settle at that level of a kind of arm's length relationship with God that we'd sort of put to one side. I think the other thing Pascal would say, and other Christian theologians have said, is that in a way, because we are both creatures and because we are fallen, we are broken, we are fractured as people. We're kind of almost not capable of seeing God face to face. If we saw God face to face, it would be so terrifying, so overwhelming, we would not be able to stand. And therefore, God, out of his mercy, hides himself from us. And that's another way in which you could express that same answer.
It annoys me because I want everything to be quantifiable and easy, especially as someone that doesn't believe in God. But I mean, Pascal sums it up so nicely. One of my favorite quotes from him is, "To make light of philosophy is to be a true philosopher."
Yeah.
And it ties into all of this. It's a difficult one, and squaring faith with also not just having blind faith. These are some of the arguments they're having as well at the time. It's fascinating how that whole concept that Pascal spoke about is just ever more relevant now than ever. It's more relevant than in the time that he wrote it. And I feel like that's perhaps the sign of a great thinker, is that their ideas grow with time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And one of his things is, the greatness of reason is to know where it has to stop. Reason, and he's not like someone like a Søren Kierkegaard or a figure like that. He has no place for reason at all. He thinks reason is a thoroughly misleading. Pascal has a place for it. He's a scientist. He really does believe in reason as helping us understand the way the world is. He just makes a big distinction between physics and metaphysics. Helps us understand the physical world, doesn't help us much in understanding God. Now, he thinks there are good reasons for believing in God, but he thinks they're only the kind of reasons that will convince you if you already believe, if you like. It's the heart that perceives God, not the reason. Now, he says there are ways you can discover that by, as he says, acting as if you believe. So if you have this instinct that maybe there is a God after all, maybe I should give it a go. He says, well, okay, just try this experiment. Try living as if it's true for a while and see what happens. So it's not like, he doesn't have any place for reason at all, but he just thinks that thinking of God as something you can reason yourself towards just doesn't work.
How can young people specifically learn from Pascal?
Yeah. Well, I think Pascal, I think number one, I think Pascal does talk to us about the limits of science, the limits of reason. We live in a world which, as you say, is often told it's all about what you can measure, about what you can analyze, what you put in a test tube. But that's absolutely right and proper, but there's a limit to that. And and I think there are increasing numbers of young people today who kind of sense there is something more than that. There is that approach to life is a very kind of limited and rather kind of shriveled understanding of life. There's a much more to that beyond that. And so therefore Pascal is someone who I think helps us to see some of the limits of science and reason, the value of it at the same time, and puts it in its right sort of place. I think he's someone who can it can help us sort of see the real nature of humanity. But one of the things I think is interesting about Pascal is two inventions that happened just before his own life: the telescope and the microscope. So you've got Galileo's telescope that suddenly enabled us to see into space, and we could see the planets, we could see the stars, we could see how vast the universe was, and we could realize that we are not the center of it. That the Earth is not the center of everything. It revolves around the sun. So in other words, suddenly Pascal is someone who's able to talk about the smallness, the insignificance of humanity. And also the microscope, we were able to see the tiniest bits of a fly and the legs on a fly and the hairs on the legs of the fly and the tiniest elements of reality. So Pascal's living in an age that has changed the way that we human beings think about ourselves. 100 years ago, 100 years before him, you had people like John Calvin or Martin Luther or Thomas Aquinas before that kind of believed that, the humanity was the center of everything. This world was the center of everything. And Pascal is very modern in the sense that he realizes that we are, in the vastness of space, we're a pretty insignificant thing. And he talks about that in ways that really resonate with us today. He has this great phrase, le silence éternel des espaces infinis m'effraie, the eternal silence of infinite space terrifies me. That's a very modern thing to say. Calvin and Luther would never have said that a century before. So I think he's able to express that. But at the same time, he says there is this smallness, this insignificance, the fact that we are capable of great cruelty, of great harm to each other, we damage each other, we are selfish, we are all that stuff. But we have this extraordinary capacity to understand the world, to master it, to create amazing things, even greater than the ones that he did, to love one another, to know God. And he really captures, I think, this sense of both the insignificance and the significance of humanity. Our weakness and our greatness, more than almost anybody else. And I think when you're growing up, realizing that that's who you are, someone with enormous potential to do enormous things and to know God and to flourish into someone who has that true happiness of being shaped in the form of true humanity, but also the possibility you might go in the other direction too. There's a real bit of wisdom.
Graham Tomlin, thank you so much for coming on the show. I wish we had like 7 hours to speak about this, because there's so much in the book, and it's crazy to read it and then try and implement just the golden nuggets because it's all great. So appreciate your time. Where can people find the book and more of your work?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book is published by Hodder, and I get it on Amazon or any sort of order it through any bookshop. Blaise Pascal, the man who made the modern world. If you want to find out more about what I do, is that I help to run a website called seenandunseen.com, which is trying to think a little bit like Pascal does. What Pascal does is to try to help you see how Christian faith makes sense of the world. And that's kind of what this website does. It looks at all kinds of issues in contemporary life and culture, stuff that's in the news, bigger cultural questions, and think, what does Christian faith, how does Christian faith help you understand those better? How might it shed a new light on it? And the idea is that, there's all the seen stuff, the politics and economics and history and stuff that we all talk about. But what does that look like in the light of the unseen realities of God and Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and so on, and faith? So seenandunseen.com, that would be the place to go. And you'll find lots of material there, lots of other podcasts that we do, as well as articles and other material that hopefully we'll find really interesting.